Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 164 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today I'm breaking this up into two different parts. I'm going to first look at 1 Kings chapter 22, starting in verse 10, and then we're going to be looking at 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Now, these events, though they're spread apart by the books of the Bible, they're really happening relatively close together, not right on top of each other, but of somewhat closeness. So yesterday, when I ended off, we had Jehoshaphat and we had Ahab meeting together, preparing for battle, and they are consulting the prophets. And as I said, I believe that these were actually the prophets of Ashtoreth, though Jehoshaphat's not saying it that way. I think that they're just saying, well, bring out some prophets. And I would say he might be a little naive here in a sense, that Jehoshaphat in his heart, I believe he so wanted the kingdoms to be united, to be together. We're going to see he gets into the same problem again later in his life. It's sort of one of the marks against him. There's not very many. Jehoshaphat really was a godly king, but his problem really was that he wanted to restore peace and unity between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. I never see any signs that he had an ulterior motive in that, like, if I can bring them back together, I can then be the king over all of it. I don't really see him having that manipulative aspect to himself, but I do believe that he just wanted them to be all together. And he's a little naive on that part, isn't he? Because it's the Lord that broke them apart. And so the Lord is the only one who can bring them back together. So if Jehoshaphat really wanted to unite the nations, it wouldn't come through marriage, it wouldn't come through war, it wouldn't come through trade agreements, which is what he tries to do later. It's going to come through prayer. And so keep this in mind in your own life. Well, remember they've consulted these different prophets, and finally, all these prophets are just given a favorable response. And then this is when Jehoshaphat's like, is there not another prophet? And Ahab says, well, there is one more, but he never gives a favorable prophecy. It's like, well, we don't listen to the one that tells us what we don't want to hear. We only listen to the people that tell us what we want to hear. It's sort of the mindset of people go to where they know their ear is going to be itched. Sort of an older phrase, not used as much anymore. But people are going to go where they hear what they want to hear. And yet, this prophet's brought out, kind of dusted off, and when they say, well, so what do you say? He then gives a very sarcastic, mocking response, mocking the other prophets, and just being like, oh yeah, sure, go on up, you'll win this battle, no problem. And then, of course, the king wanting to know, there's always this thing inside of the heart of man, even Ahab sitting there, no, I really want to know. And it's like, oh yeah, it's not going to go good at all. You're going to be wiped out. The nations, the tribes are going to be scattered. And at this news, it's like, oh, no way. And then Micaiah basically comes back saying, no, I had a vision of heaven, and the Lord was saying, who will go and who will lead Ahab to go into this battle? Who will cause Ahab's folly, basically? And finally, one of the deceiving spirits says, I will go. And the story that we get here is the Lord says, well, how will you do this? And he's like, oh, I will put deceit in the prophets' mouths, so these prophets will prophesy falsely. And at this news, though, Zedekiah, another prophet nearby, he whacks the prophet upside the head for having said this. I mean, this is almost like a movie at this point, right? These events are real life and unfolding. Well, I don't want to linger over that part too much longer, but I will say Jehoshaphat goes into the battle. But Ahab is again very crafty here. And Ahab says, well, I'm going to go in regular clothing, the clothes of a normal soldier, but you go out as the king. Well, with this, you'd think you'd have to be a lunatic to do that, because you know that everybody's spear, sword, arrow is going to be pointed on your direction. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what the Syrians do when he first heads out. They are ready to kill the king, but then something happens and they realize that's not Ahab. And yet God has a way of always finding his mark, right? Because one of the Syrian soldiers looses an arrow wildly, and it finds its mark, going in between the chinks of the armor of Ahab. And that brings his death. And as had been foretold by the prophet, that his blood would be lapped up by dogs, and blood was all over his chariot by the time they reached a place that they could inspect his body, and it was already too late. And the dogs came and lapped up the blood. Well, this was the end of Ahab, and now his son took the throne. And we're going to look more at him tomorrow, but I wanted to move into one of my more favorite Bible stories, really. And it is when the nation of Judah, now, of course, sometimes it gets difficult, and I do apologize, because yesterday I even made a statement speaking of Jehoshaphat being the king of Israel. He was the king of Judah, not of Israel at this point. So he is the king of Judah, and the nation comes under an attack. So now the ones coming up are the Moabites, the Ammonites, or Ammon, and it's the Meunites. And so they come up to make war against Jehoshaphat. And it says when Jehoshaphat receives this news, he's terrified, he's afraid, but afraid because he realizes we can't do this on our own. Now what does he do? He turns to his counsel, he turns to the Lord, and he cries out to the Lord, this army is too great for us. What can we do, Lord? And through one of the priests, the word is given that the people are to gather together. They are to march out against the enemy singing songs. And while they are on their way out to meet the enemy with the choir out front, not the soldiers, the Lord would confuse the enemy and they would fight one another. And by the time Jehoshaphat and his men get to the battlefield, everyone there is dead. And it says that the plunder was so great left in that valley that it took them 3 days to haul it away. Could you imagine? That is so much being left there, armor, gold, silver, all this stuff, that it took them 3 days to haul away the plunder. Well, in this, and as I say, I normally that's like an hour-long sermon, so that's why I'm trying to be careful not to really dive into it much deeper. But I want to say, when we come across challenges in our life, pause, pray. They called the entire nation to fast before going out to face this army. And the Lord answered their prayers and their fasting. And he answered by saying, go out and praise me. Praise me for the victory which is in your hands. And they hadn't even won the battle yet. So after your time of prayer and fasting, can you get up and start praying? Start praising God? Can you get up and start praising Him for the victory that's already come, even though you might not can see it yet? That's exactly what Jehoshaphat and his people did as they went out to meet the army. And the Lord gave them victory. Well, as I said, we're going to see a couple of allegiances which Jehoshaphat makes that he really shouldn't have made, and this is with Ahab's son. And I think, again, I really believe that in his heart he's thinking, hey, we're going to have some good relationships here. These are our brothers and our sisters, and let's repair that. Well, brothers and sisters, I do hope that your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.